So we proceed now with our keynote speech. Dr. Coomaraswamy is a lawyer, diplomat, and a human rights advocate, and she's also the former UN Undersecretary General and Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict from 2006 to 2012. She will talk to us about gender protection and reproductive rights. Dr. Coomaraswamy, please join me here on the stage.
Good morning, as Dr. Mantu said, and I hope everybody who comes up here says that, to liven us up. I would like to begin my address by thanking Médecins Sans Frontières for inviting me here today. Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, as I will refer in the rest of the speech, also known as Doctors Without Borders, is an international humanitarian medical non-governmental organization best known for its projects in conflict zones and in countries affected by diseases. MSF was established on December 22nd, 1971, by a group of French doctors and journalists in Paris. Notable among them, the founders were Dr. Bernard Kouchner, who worked closely with me when I was special representative, and Dr. Mas Recamier. The motivation for the organization was a response to the limitations that humanitarians faced in the Biafran War in Nigeria and their desire to provide emergency medical care wherever it was needed most, without consideration of race, religion, or political affiliation. Right from the outset, MSF was founded on principles of medical ethics, independence, impartiality, neutrality, and perhaps most important, bearing witness. During the 1980s, MSF expanded rapidly, extending their operations to more than 23 countries by the end of the decade. They were heavily active in numerous conflict zones and natural disaster areas, such as Ethiopia during the famine, Bangladesh, Lebanon, Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion, and El Salvador. This was also the period in which the concept of bearing witness became a significant part of MSF's mission. Speaking out against atrocities and human rights abuses they witnessed while providing care. In 1999, MSF was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, in recognition of their pioneering work around the world and the principled approach they maintained to their operations. In the 21st century, MSF continued to be involved in major global crises, including the HIV/AIDS epidemic, especially the sub-Saharan Africa, providing life-saving antiretroviral treatment. The organization has also dealt with contemporary issues affecting marginalized communities, including migrants and refugees. They continue to advocate for access to essential medicines and challenge excessive prices and inadequacies within the global pharmaceutical industry. I have dealt with MSF many times in the field. I remember flying into Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh just after the attack on the Rohingya population by the Myanmar army. Refugees came streaming in. I was first-hand witness to the many humanitarian heroes that actually work in the field. First, the refugees are met by United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Committee of the Red Cross, where people are registered, there is identification, and tracing begins. Then you can watch as UNHCR prepares the housing for the refugees. UNICEF deals with water and sanitation and safe spaces for children. The World Food Programme organizes and delivers food. Then WHO, with international NGOs such as MSF, set up health clinics. The refugees are mostly bleeding, women are devastated after sexual assault, and children are malnourished and often fainting. It is this reality that MSF deals with in the field on a daily basis. On behalf of all the people in this world who respect humanity, I want to thank you for your service. I want to welcome MSF and all their invitees to Sri Lanka. I was basically asked to speak about reproductive rights and the problems of women, girls, and LGBTIQ people in situations of armed conflict based on my experience as Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict and as Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in the 1990s. I thought I should divide the address into two parts. The first part will dwell on the normative framework with regard to reproductive rights and the expectations created by this framework. The second part will use this lens to look at issues facing women, girls, especially, and trans people in armed conflict situations. About 35 years ago, when I was working at the Marga Institute in Sri Lanka, the main emphasis of our work was combating extreme poverty, one of the essential Millennial Development Goals set out by the United Nations. One of the critical indicators in determining the development of a country was the maternal mortality ratio. This is the number of maternal deaths per 100,000 live births during a given time period. It reflects the risk of maternal death per childbirth or per live birth. Data for these indicators are usually collected through national health surveys, civil registration, and vital statistics systems, and other administrative sources. Women's health measures are an essential indicator of a society's health and well-being. They give essential insights into the well-being of a woman and the effectiveness of the overall healthcare system. For countries with a high maternal mortality rate, it is an indictment of a healthcare system in a country. It points to inadequate access to healthcare services, including skilled healthcare professionals, as well as the probability that there is insufficient infrastructure. It also indicates a lack of emergency services and poor quality standards in antenatal and postnatal care. Maternal mortality figures also provide important insight into the socioeconomic and political environment and the status of the country. High rates of maternal mortality are usually found where women have limited access to education, employment, and medical services. They are also in situations where there is high rates of poverty and cultural practices limiting access to medical services. Current Sustainable Development Goal 3.1 has the aspiration of reducing the maternal mortality rate to less than 70 per 100,000 live births by 2030. The first feminist struggles in the early years and for decades in the health area was to fight for low maternal mortality rates. But reproductive rights are more than development indicators. They lie at the core of equality for women, girls, and LGBTIQ people. This was evident when the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women was drafted. Article 12 laid the grounds for healthcare and access to family planning within the framework of equality. It also held that access to informational material and educational material on family planning was an important aspect of the Convention. Most importantly, General Recommendation 24 to CEDAW speaks about equality in the right to decide freely and responsibly on the number and spacing of children. It speaks about access to family planning, contraception, maternal health care, and access to safe abortions where legal. All this in an atmosphere where there must be no violence or intimidation. Information, safety, and access undergird CEDAW. It is what will make equality real in the lives of many women. Women will be free to make their decisions in the interest of themselves, their families, and their careers. National governments and courts have used the provisions in CEDAW to provide for women. The Colombian Constitutional Court, invoking CEDAW, made a series of far-reaching decisions stating that women's decisions on reproductive health are fundamental rights that are intertwined with their right to health, life, dignity, and autonomy. In Nepal, too, courts adopted a series of cases interpreting CEDAW to provide access and infrastructure for women with regard to reproductive health. When women can plan their families, they are likely to participate as equals in society, likely to pursue education and employment, and likely to break the cycle of poverty. By the 1990s, the world was moving beyond development indicators and even the narrative of equality to frame the discourse in terms of freedom. Margaret Sanger, a founder of this movement, said, "No woman can call herself free who does not control her body." Kamala Harris recently said, "When you restrict a woman's right to make decisions about her own body, you're not just restricting her right to control her future, you're restricting her ability to fully participate in the economy and our democracy." The International Conference on Population and Development, held in 1994 in Cairo, a landmark event, defines reproductive health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, in all matters relating to the reproductive system and its functions and processes. Reproductive health, therefore, implies that people are able to have a satisfying and safe sex life, and that they have the capability to reproduce and the freedom to decide if and when and how often to do so. According to these developments, reproductive rights is the freedom of women to choose and the freedom of a woman to decide about her reproductive and sexual health. Now that we have discussed the normative framework with regard to reproductive rights, what does all this mean in conflict situations? It seems to be another world. When I was UN Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, I visited the Eastern Congo, where I met, let us call her Eva, to protect her. She was 13 years old. While walking to school one day, she was kidnapped by armed militia and taken to their camp. She was forced to be nude day and night and was constantly raped and gang raped. She also had to help in cooking and serving these young men. Finally, she managed to escape. A truck driver picked her up, wrapped her up in some cloth, and brought her to Pansy Hospital. That is where I met her, tears rolling down her face as she clutched a baby more than half her size. Pansy Hospital in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is renowned for its specialized care and services, particularly in women's health. Founded in 1999 by Dr. Denis Mukwege, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the hospital has become a crucial healthcare provider in the region. Pansy Hospital is perhaps the best known for its work in treating women who have suffered sexual violence. The hospital offers comprehensive medical, psychological, and social support to survivors of rape and other forms of sexual violence, often linked to the conflicts in the region. The hospital employs a unique holistic healing model known as the 4 pillars of healing, which include medical treatment, psychological support, socioeconomic assistance, and legal assistance. In addition to care for survivors of sexual violence, Pansy Hospital also provides a full range of obstetric and gynecological services, including prenatal care, safe delivery, and treatment of obstetric fistulas. Dr. Denis Mukwege and the Pansy Hospital have been active in international advocacy, raising awareness about the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. These features make Pansy Hospital a beacon of hope for many Congolese women and a critical institution in the fight against sexual violence and inadequate health care. Dr. Mukwege is a truly modern-day hero, and doctors like that must never be forgotten. I visited Pansy Hospital and talked to many of the victims, including a pregnant 10-year-old. The complex normative framework for reproductive rights has little meaning in terrible situations of armed conflict. Sexual violence in these situations is not only a crime, but an assault on women's reproductive organs. It is a denial of everything reproductive rights stands for: freedom, equality, and reproductive health. So many of the women and girls I met had completely damaged reproductive organs and other injuries. At Pansy Hospital, doctors came from all over the world to do reconstructive surgery. The violence the victims suffer have serious consequences for the future and an inability to enjoy all the conditions set out for reproductive health and rights. They are fearful of their sexuality and are often overcome by mental health challenges, especially in the beginning. Many of them will soon be HIV positive, pending a lifetime fighting the consequences. A wholesome approach is necessary, but not always available. In prolonged armed conflict situations, generations of women and girls may suffer in silence. Many young women often find themselves pregnant after experiencing sexual violence. In countries like Congo and Rwanda, with a strong Catholic tradition, abortion is not an option. Some of the girls are reluctant to give their children up also for adoption. I was often saddened by the fact that many of the girls at Pansy were children who were mothers, young mothers that they had to force to lose their childhood. There was great sadness in their eyes, even though the babies themselves were always innocent and delightful. Sexual violence comes in many forms. The well documented case, shall we call her Maria, tells another story. Maria was a young girl from Honduras. She lived in a community ruled by armed gangs. Law enforcement at that time was non existent. The violent gangs kidnapped and raped young women, much like in some armed conflict situation. Maria's family was terrified for her. They decided to send her to the United States in a human smuggling operation. They contacted a well known individual and made arrangements for Maria. Finally, Maria left with a group of would be asylum seekers. They were led by what is termed a coyote, who took charge of the journey. They survived a lot of hardship, but near the US border, the coyote took Maria and a few other girls and led them to a place that turned out to be a brothel. The girls were beaten into submission and closely monitored. They had to service regular customers. Maria managed to escape and found refuge in a church. The church took care of her and decided for her to return to her parents. She was then returned back in the situation of gang warfare. She has no escape from fear. Trafficking of women and girls is a major problem in the modern globalized world. But as is often said, and as what is a theme in this conference, traffickers fish in the sea of migration. In some ways, refugees, displaced persons, human smuggling, asylum seeking, trafficking are all part of the same phenomenon, the phenomenon of global migration with the call for global responsibility. The need for international action and cooperation are necessary for a humane solution. The problem is often depicted as one in which people from the global south, out of self-interest, want to swarm and swallow up the global north. That is not the story. For many people coming out of armed conflict situations, it is an existential choice between life and death. They have very few real options or choices. Northern countries are often implicated in wars that create the population exodus. Migration is therefore an issue that the world must address collectively to ensure humanity for the victims and for the well-being of their citizens. For women, girls, and LGBTIQ people, these existential survival journeys can be a nightmare. I have met many women and girls in flight. All the indices of violence against women in normal situations are doubled or tripled in these cases. In refugee camps, researchers find that domestic violence is rampant. Sexual violence by guards or violence on the way to use toilets or to collect firewood is constantly recorded. Managing menstruation becomes very difficult. Many other reproductive disorders also result, affecting reproductive health. Medical services and psychological services do not exist or are very minimal. In these situations, that organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières come to the fore and are a lifeline to women. Without them, women would die or suffer in silence. The bearing witness part of Médecins Sans Frontières and other organizations also keep the world on alert about the type of violence and brutality that is being unleashed. I cannot underscore enough what it means to be a displaced person or a refugee from an armed conflict region. When I was on the fact-finding mission on Myanmar, an old Rohingya woman came to see us at the Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh. I could tell by looking at her and her demeanor that she must have been a woman of some wealth, but she told me she had to flee, leaving everything behind. The only thing she clutched to her bosom were her documents, her ID card, and the countless other documents the Myanmar government issues for Rohingya people. Displaced, hopeless, and often hated by the host community, the documents are your only hope of return. In armed conflict zones, trans individuals are often particularly singled out. The well-documented case of Noor is one such example. Noor Shakar, a transgendered woman who lived through the turmoil of the Syrian civil war, offers a compelling and harrowing account of her journey. Her story is illustrative of the intersection of conflict, gender identity, and social marginalization. Noor was born in Homs, Syria, and realized she was transgender at a young age. However, living in a conservative society where such identities were not accepted, she faced significant challenges. The onsets of the Syrian civil war in 2011 only exacerbated these difficulties. During the war, she was harassed and persecuted not only because of the conflict, but also due to her gender identity. Noor faced violence from multiple sides. She was targeted by government forces, rebel groups, and radical Islamist factions, many of whom saw her gender identity as an affront to their beliefs. Each side subjugated her to instances of abuse, torture, and harassment. In a country with strict honor codes, trans people were often beaten, stoned, or sometimes, in the case of extremists, publicly executed and beheaded. Desperate for safety and dignity, she eventually fled Syria and began her journey as a refugee seeking asylum in Europe. The path was fraught with dangers, but she finally made it to Sweden, a country known for its more progressive stance on LGBTIQ rights. Today, violence affecting women, girls, and trans people in armed conflict situations is not only sexual violence. They face threats to their bodily security and bodily integrity. I met a young girl, shall we call her Aisha, in Afghanistan. She was very beautiful with troubled blue-green eyes. She was a devoted student, but the Taliban had blown up her school. While she was at home, a drone attack by the US-led coalition targeted her house, though later they apologized, saying it was collateral damage. In both cases, Aisha narrowly escaped. Her only plea to me was to ensure that she was able to continue with her education. Nobody wants to talk about it, but the greatest threat to our planet are these new technologies of war. The use of drones, robots, and artificial intelligence bombing have made serious inroads into humanitarian protection. Hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings were once protected spaces under international law. Attacking them would be war crimes and crimes against humanity. Modern militaries, not wanting to put ground forces in danger, just use drones or devastating bombs to raze a building if they think an enemy combatant is inside. Recently in Gaza, we are witnessing schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings being razed to the ground, with children being some of the greatest victims. As shock and awe guides military strategy, as opposed to the Geneva Convention's proportional warfare, the medical challenges are immense. Victims of drone attacks and aerial bombardment informed by artificial intelligence are killed, and if they survive, often suffer from a range of traumatic and blast-related injuries. These can include shrapnel, wounds, amputations, burns, and internal injuries. In many conflict zones where drones and artificial intelligence-informed aerial bombardment are used, medical infrastructure may be inadequate or overwhelmed, leading to delays in the treatment of injuries. Civilians in regions with this kind of bombardment may experience chronic fear, anxiety, and stress due to the persistent possibility of drone strikes. An aerial bombardment, this constant state of alert can lead to widespread psychological trauma, including depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD, especially among children. I witnessed this in Afghanistan. Drone strikes and aerial bombardment can lead to environmental contamination, including chemical exposure from the destruction of infrastructure like chemical plants, factories, or storage facilities. This poses a long-term health risk for both the local population and medical personnel. Residues from explosives and other weaponry can pose hazards long after the immediate strike, causing chronic health issues for those in contact with affected areas. Drone warfare and aerial bombardment can advertently or inadvertently damage or destroy critical health infrastructure, including hospital, clinics, and supply houses, exacerbating the crisis and complicating injury treatment and disease management. Conflict zones often face significant barriers to accessing adequate medical care. Drone strikes can further impede mobility, making it difficult for wounded to reach medical facilities as well as for healthcare workers to provide timely aid. Drone strikes and aerial bombardment can contribute to the displacement of populations, leading to refugees and internally displaced persons. This kind of warfare needs review and reassessment. We have to rein the violence in. There is really no time to waste. These issues should be high on the international agenda. There is no international legal or ethical framework for the use of drones or any of these robots or AI weapon systems. International legal and moral frameworks, including holding countries and individuals accountable, must catch up with the use and abuse of these frightening technologies of war by modern militaries. Women and children are the primary victims. One of the oldest forms of warfare, which is suddenly re-emerging today, and which really defies humanitarians, is to introduce starvation as a method of war. I witnessed this in Ethiopia. To deny food and relief to the other side. Again, women, girls, and LGBTIQ people are deeply affected. Not only are their reproductive organs affected, but their essential health is under assault. The Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute make this kind of warfare a war crime and a crime against humanity. Starvation is a severe deficiency in caloric energy intake required to maintain an organism's life. It has profound and potentially life-threatening effects on the human body. The initial symptoms are feelings of hunger, fatigue, and weakness, accompanied by irritability and cognitive decline. There's gradually a reduction in muscle mass and a loss of strength. With time, there is organ damage to the heart, liver, and kidneys. The whole gastrointestinal system is also affected. The immune system is depressed and there is increased susceptibility to infections. Reproductive health is also affected with the absence of menstruation and the possibility of infertility. There are mental health consequences, of course. Practitioners have noticed anxiety, depression, and engagement in risky behavior to obtain food and commit crimes. The effects of starvation are both acute and long-lasting, impacting nearly every system in the body. The re-emergence of starvation as a strategy of war is not only a slap in the face of humanitarians, like all of you who work in the field, but a very serious violation of centuries of international humanitarian law. Finally, around the world, we are increasingly seeing the presence of female combatants. From armed fighters to suicide bombers, women are now actively involved in conflict. With regard female armed fighters, no aspect of the Geneva Conventions really deals with their needs. As prisoners of war, they will need reproductive health services and special care. There is nothing to guarantee that treatment. I have met many female fighters. They have admirable courage and agency, but are usually within tightly knit structures dominated by men. Let me conclude by saying that any crisis makes women, girls, and LGBTIQ people very vulnerable. A prolonged armed conflict accentuates this vulnerability and makes it chronic. Understanding and having empathy with that vulnerability is key to assisting victims in conflict zones. Vulnerability is why the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute separate civilians from combatants. The purpose is to protect women, children, and the elderly. Understanding the vulnerability is the core of humanitarian law. It is the core of humanitarian medical practice. If we lose that understanding of vulnerability, we are well on the way to destroying the world. We must all stand together across all regions and nationalities to insist that everyone abide by the rules of war, respect humanitarian work, and embrace our common destiny. Thank you.